Stop me if you've heard this before. Phones these days are just too big. Why can't you buy a smartphone with high-end specs that isn't as big as a novelty oversized Pop-Tart? It's an argument that plays out on social media every so often, with a lot of old school phone nerds like me fondly remembering the Sony Compact series and the various mini devices from Samsung and HTC over the years. Sure, there's the iPhone 13 mini, but all signs point to that being discontinued once the iPhone 14 launches. In the 2020s, if you want the fastest performance and all the latest features, it almost inevitably means going big, especially if you're buying Android. But one of the exceptions to that rule last year was ASUS, with the pint-sized powerhouse that was the Zenfone 8. And it's back in 2022 with the successor, the Zenfone 9. Once again with the small form factor, kitted out with the latest Snapdragon, a ton of RAM and storage, multi-day battery life, and a uniquely stabilized camera. And there's even that rarest of unicorn features, the 3.5mm headphone jack. So let's jump in and find out what it's like to use the most compact Android flagship of the year. I'm Alex W with XDA, and this is our review of the ASUS Zenfone 9. First up, let's address the elephant in the room. There's no Zenfone 9 Pro or 9 Flip. That 3-year experiment with flip cameras is sadly over. From speaking to ASUS reps, it's clear the regular Zenfone 8 was the more successful model last year, and that bringing the flip camera forward at the price point they wanted just turned out to be a bit of a technological dead end. They couldn't make it work. So RIP to one of my favourite weirdo camera features from the past 2 years. This was such a fun camera system to use, and it's a real shame it's not coming back. Anyway, back to the Zenfone 9 that does actually exist, as opposed to the 9 Flip that I wish existed. As you might have noticed, ASUS has switched up its design language this year. The back is much more angular, furnished in this extremely matte plastic. The texture is actually a little different depending on which colour option you pick. The blue is almost like a rough craft paper texture, while the red is a little smoother and the matte black is a nice happy medium. The right angle back, ASUS says, helps it fit more stuff inside, and to be sure, it's fitting a lot of stuff inside here. There's the latest Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1, up to 16GB of RAM, 256GB of storage, a 4300mAh battery, and all sealed up with IP68 water and dust resistance. Only noticeable feature you're not getting is wireless charging, unfortunately, but at least there is a 30-watt wired charging brick provided in the box. And prices for the base model with 8GB of RAM plus 128GB of storage start at $699 in the US, which is pretty impressive value proposition before you even get to talking about the cameras or any of the other unique features. The overall vibe here kind of cribs from the design philosophy of ASUS's laptops. That's reflected in the slightly geeky design cues you see on the back panel here, like the camera specs and the over-engineered appearance of the 2 rear cameras. There's a pretty masculine and almost industrial look to it, especially in the red and black. I'm not in love with this design, don't get me wrong, it's not a bad looking phone, but I think it somehow manages to be simultaneously too bland and a little bit too extra. With the plain textured back and lens protrusions in the printed areas, it looks okay, and I like how grippy it is compared to the average slippery glass slab. The very flat sidewalls definitely help in that respect too, but there are plenty of examples of phones out there of all sizes that are easier on the eyes. On the front, the Zenfone 9 screen uses the same 5.9-inch 120Hz Full HD Plus AMOLED as last year's model, only now behind a sturdier Gorilla Glass Victus panel. The use of the same components as last year though kind of explains the slightly asymmetrical borders that we're seeing here, with both a visible chin border down below and the tiniest of foreheads up top compared to the svelte bezels on the side. This isn't an LTPO panel, so it's missing the battery-saving refresh rate technology that you'll find on, say, an S22 Ultra or a Pixel 6 Pro. But as we'll get to in a little bit, battery life is definitely something you don't need to worry about on this phone. So while the screen is a 120Hz panel, by default it's set to ASUS's auto refresh rate setting, which runs at 90Hz most of the time and scales up or down depending on the app. 90 is a pretty nice balance between battery life and smoothness though, so I've kept to this default for most of my time with the phone. And although the panel may be mostly unchanged from the Zenfone 8, it can still boast 1100 nits of peak brightness and is capable of ramping up high enough for easy sunlight visibility, not as crazy high as an S22 Ultra in its daylight mode, but definitely enough that you don't have to strain your eyes when using it outside. Despite its diminutive size, the Zenfone 9 also performs really well in terms of audio. The dual speaker system easily competes with larger flagships in terms of volume and bass, And with the plastic construction of the back panel, you'll definitely feel that bass as you hold the phone. That could be a good thing or a bad thing. I know some folks who hate the feel of sound vibrations coming through a plastic gadget. If that's you, I guess you'll probably have to pick up a case. The 3.5mm headphone jack isn't a huge deal for me personally, but I know there are some wired audio diehards out there who really appreciate this feature in a phone. You'll find the DAC behind this thing is powerful enough to drive even large studio headphones, though obviously plugging a huge pair of headphones into something this small can be a little bit awkward. Everything else about using this phone is as fast and responsive as you'd expect from the latest Snapdragon 8 Plus, especially since I've been using the version with a beefy 16 gigs of RAM. Everything loads near instantly, and I haven't need to worry about apps getting dumped out of memory with heavy multitasking. In other words, this is 100% of the performance that you get out of any major Android flagship, only, it's small. For me personally, going back to a device this size has taken a bit of adjustment. Full disclosure, I actually prefer bigger phones on the whole and have for many years now. But even though something of this size wouldn't necessarily be my first choice, I do appreciate the easier one-hand ability that you get, actually be able to reach across the full width of the screen with minimal thumb strain. Obviously, the other side of that is less real estate for content, whether it's games, video, or just random nonsense on Twitter. And I've also been a bit frustrated by the typing experience at times. I can definitely tap out messages more quickly with 2 thumbs on a bigger phone. None of that stuff is a huge surprise though. What might be more surprising if you're familiar with the likes of the iPhone 13 mini is this phone's other major strength, the battery. Although it's small, the Zenfone 9 is pretty chunky, and that internal space is filled up by a 4300 mAh cell, which, paired with an efficient chip and a small display, makes for excellent longevity. Only thing you're missing out on is wireless charging, which really seems like it should be a table stakes feature in every phone at this price range, but ASUS says it's left out the Qi coil in exchange for just fitting it with a larger battery, which I guess is a fair trade-off. Outside of a Google Pixel or maybe a Nothing Phone 1, ASUS's software is as close to pure stock Android as you're likely to find in any phone. The UI basically is the same as what you get on a Pixel, only without some of the more elaborate Google features. And where ASUS specific features have been added, you'll mostly find them in the settings where they make sense, and it's easy to ignore them if you're not interested. One of the biggest new features this time around is the Smart Key. This is built into the power button on the side of the phone, which also houses the capacitive fingerprint scanner. There are a few more tricks hiding behind here though, besides just quick and easy unlocks. As well as being able to choose shortcut commands for a long press or a double tap, you can now swipe up or down to perform various actions like scrolling to the top or bottom of a web page or pulling down the notification shade. But I found this is one of those things that sounds more useful than it actually is in practice. Given the placement of the button, I'd accidentally trigger this all the time when just holding the device normally. And given the relatively small size of the Zenfone 9, it's easy to just reach up and pull down the notification shade in the normal way. There's also a fast voice input, basically an instant transcribe feature that works in any app and turns what you say into text instantly. Sure, you can do this with your keyboard app, but sticking this behind a physical shortcut makes it a lot more accessible. Other Zen UI features are a mix of things we've seen before on Pixels, like a double tap gesture on the back to take a screenshot or perform other actions. There's some stuff we've seen in third-party Android skins too, like twin apps for running more than one account in social apps like WhatsApp, Messenger, or Line. And the Edge tool takes inspiration from the long-standing Samsung Edge feature, letting you pin apps behind this little swipeable shortcut bar. In terms of the visuals, the performance, the cleanliness of the software, and the helpful features that have been added, it's hard to fault ASUS's Zen UI, but if you're looking for long-term software support, you may be a bit disappointed. Right now, the company is only making a firm commitment to 2 years of Android platform updates, putting it squarely behind the likes of Samsung, Google, and even OnePlus. The one feature that elevates the Zenfone 9 above just being a pretty good small flagship is the camera setup. There are 2 50-megapixel sensors around the back, both wide and ultra-wide, but the big deal is the stabilization built around that main camera. It uses a gimbal, so it's able to compensate for movement an order of magnitude stronger than the standard OIS that you might find in any high-end phone. The movement of the gimbal is a little hard to make out just by looking at the camera. It's easier to see this with the visualization in the camera app, which shows the buffer area around your frame as you're moving the phone around. A couple of main benefits of this kind of gimbal. First, obviously your video has an extra level of physical stabilization, so moving shots look much smoother. And because it's hardware based, you also get a lot more wiggle room in low light conditions. Plus the gimbal lets you leave the shutter open for longer in long exposures, making for clearer night mode images. Effectively, it's everything you get from OIS in a phone camera, only dialed up to another level. It's really pretty impressive what ASUS has been able to achieve in a smaller handset, even if the camera modules themselves are pretty comically huge. There are limits to this technology though. The gimbal is adept at smoothing out shaky motion from your hands or rough terrain in a vehicle, but the harder jolts you get when walking or running may still be visible. So don't expect to be able to break into a full sprint and have this thing compensate 100%. This is still a smartphone camera after all. Another neat feature helped by the gimbal is the handheld light tracing mode, technically in beta, but works pretty well and lets you capture artistic looking long exposures of traffic at night, flowing water or crowds of people. As far as overall image performance on those two main cameras go, they're pretty good, with one consistent gripe that's most noticeable in HDR shots and night mode pictures. Anytime the phone has to do a lot of processing in an image, there's a lot of over-sharpening that goes along with that, to an almost obnoxious extent in some nighttime scenarios. This phone has had 2 software updates in the time that I've been using it, and this issue has become less bothersome lately, but it is still there. And you can see the difference here in the stock camera app versus the Zenfone 9 using a modified version of the Google camera app. With that said, overall I've been very impressed, in particular with the primary camera. There's ample dynamic range and vivid pleasing colors that don't look overcooked, and the IMX766, while not the largest image sensor around, is big enough to give you a nice bit of natural bokeh in closer shots. Plus, when you need artificial background blurring, portrait mode is also pretty decent, with reliable edge detection even in challenging scenes with moving subjects. Around front there's a 12-megapixel selfie camera that's okay but disappoints in a couple of areas. The 76-degree field of view is a bit narrow compared to a lot of high-end phones, and despite decent performance in lower light, I found images from the selfie shooter were routinely a lot grainier than I get from most competition. Even in well-lit scenes, you don't need to zoom in far to see a fair amount of luma noise. It's most noticeable around hair or any other finer details. So 1 or 2 compromises there, but overall a pretty competent camera setup. It's a shame not to see some sort of telephoto option, but considering the size and the price, I feel pretty happy with what ASUS has brought to the table here. The Zenfone 9 is ultimately something of an oddity, a rare example of a competitive high-end phone in what is still a quite compact form factor. It occupies a very niche market segment. Even Apple is expected to ditch its mini phone this year, leaving the smallest modern iPhone as the base 6.1-inch model, or I guess the SE if you can put it with those extra chunky bezels. So for a smaller player in the business, this seems like an obvious place for ASUS to be able to stand out. But there also seems to be a longer-term pattern developing with ASUS where they seem to be looking for a new thing every few generations. What do I mean by a thing? Well, a gimmick, something to stand out as what an ASUS phone is supposed to be all about. For a while, it was flip cameras, until it wasn't. Now it's small phones, but who knows how long that'll continue to be the case. We're still only a couple of generations into this particular experiment. At least the Zenfone 9's gimmick of just being a good small phone is less harebrained than some of ASUS's earlier efforts like the Pad phone, or wait, was that the Phone Pad? Yeah, both of these did actually exist at one point. Still, whatever the future holds for ASUS phones, the Zenfone 9 stands out as probably the best compact flagship you can buy in 2022, beating the S22 and iPhone 13 mini on battery life and offering a fun camera system plus fast, clean software. For me personally, I'd almost always go for a bigger phone with more space for productivity and fun, that's just me, but if you're the kind of person who wants the best Android hardware has to offer in a chassis that you can comfortably use with one hand, then ASUS has the answer to your prayers. That's going to do for now on the ASUS Zenfone 9. Let us know down in the comments what you think of it, whether you'd want a phone with this powerful hardware and a small form factor, and what about that gimbal camera, worth it or just another gimmick? In the meantime, you can catch me at AlexDoby on all the social things. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.